seen it. Keeping quiet, saying nothing, becomes as political an act as speaking out. There's no innocence. Either way, you're accountable. End quote. This explains why I dropped out of a system I viewed as irredeemably corrupt. Knowing I could not change the system, that instead the system was changing me, I left a high-pay, low-work position as tenured full professor to go back to the land. The first step towards terminating an irredeemably corrupt system is leaving it behind. So I walked away from empire. So then the question is, how to get through a life not worth living? Schopenhauer gave the answer to his own question in 3 words: will to live. Schopenhauer's successor, Nietzsche, extended this idea with his own 3-word answer: will to power. Nietzsche knew the lust for power often exceeded the will to live. Shortly before his death in 2003, the great human rights advocate and intellectual leftist Edward Said addressed the issue. Quote, "There is no point to intellectual and political work if one were a pessimist. Intellectual and political work require, nay, demand, optimism." End quote. Said was suggesting that without optimism, we might as well take the Hemingway out. They say the truth will set you free. The truth doesn't set you free. At least not in my experience. It just pisses you off. I admired Said for his courage and for his contrarian views. And as a self-proclaimed intellectual who is often accused of inappropriately meddling in political work, I am naturally inclined towards optimism. There's no reason to stir the pot if you think the human condition is hopeless. That said, I suspect Said did not know about peak oil at the global level or runaway greenhouse. Surely his optimism would have been dampened had he only known about these 2 profound consequences of our insatiable desires. Oil supply at the level of the field, the county, the state, the country, the world follows a bell-shaped curve. Go up one side smoothly, hit the peak, which has come to be known as Hubbard's Peak after the guy who discovered and described this phenomenon. Then we start coming down the other side. We began easing down the other side of Hubbard's curve more than 6 years ago with respect to crude oil, and we're falling off the oil supply cliff this year. Because this country mainlines cheap oil, it's easy to envision the complete collapse of the U.S. economy within a few months, even within a few weeks. The Great Depression will seem like the good old days when unemployment approaches 100% and the dollar is in the dustbin. Obviously, this is good news for the world's cultures and species other than our own. After all, in the name of economic growth, we have ripped minerals from the earth, often bringing down entire mountains in the process. We have harvested nearly all the old growth timber on the continent, replacing 1,000-year-old trees with toothpicks of twigs by the millions. We have hunted species to the point of extinction and beyond. We have driven livestock across almost every acre of the continent, burying entire hillsides, engendering massive erosion to choke our streams. We have burned ecosystems, and perhaps more importantly, we have put out large fires that previously covered acres and acres of land. We have spewed pollution and dumped garbage, thereby dirtying our air, fouling our water, and contributing greatly to the warming of the planet. We have paved thousands of acres, and thereby limited the movements of thousands of species. As I wrote in one of my recent books, the problem is not that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, it's that the road to hell is paved. We keep making these choices, consuming the planet, trading in tomorrow for today. We keep making these choices every single day, choosing dams over salmon, oil over whales, cars over polar bears, death over life. And when I say we keep making these choices, I don't mean you and me. We tolerate the occasional power outage and have a good time while we're at it. And we have essentially nothing to do with the dire straits we're in anyway. I mean the politicians and CEOs who run this country, or who ruin this country, depending on your perspective. They're killing the planet, and when they notice the screams, they just turn up the volume on Fox News. Hope it goes away. Meanwhile, most Americans took the blue pill from the Matrix without really thinking about the consequences. In the wake of these endless insults to our only home, Perhaps the biggest surprise is that so many native species have persisted this long, thus allowing for our continued use and enjoyment. In short, we can have a living planet or we can have civilization. We cannot have both. We drive to extinction 200 to 300 species a day, life after punishing day. Day after day after day, 200 to 300 species a day are driving to extinction. When you jump off a 100-story building, everything seems fine for a while. In fact, the ground keeps getting closer, more clear. Looks like all is going well. What could possibly go wrong? Well, maybe that one thing. It's not the fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop at the bottom. So I'm not sure what floor we're passing now, but I'm pretty sure we leaped off the cliff quite a while ago. The American pragmatist philosopher William James struggled with the same question every single day. Shall I get out of bed? Personally, I don't know how he did it. I mean, physically. I'm up eliminating the urine from my bladder before I'm really fully awake. So I'm already out of bed before I can ask the question, do I get out of bed? So I struggle with the follow-up question. Should I spend the day speaking and writing, or should I do something useful? Shall I blow up a freeway, a building, a dam, to try to bring down an industrial economy that is making us crazy and killing us? Or should I take the more civilized approach of speaking and writing and trying to convince people that we have developed a crazy set of living arrangements? Of course, a career in academia has me ill-prepared for useful work, so I have to learn a lot before I can start tearing down the omnicidal beast known as civilization. So passing Hubbard's Peak clearly is good news for the living planet on which we depend for our very lives. But it obviates technological solutions to our most pressing problems, including, for example, a runaway greenhouse. You can argue that technology has never solved a problem, but only made them worse. That each technological advance has only made this complex set of living arrangements more complicated, and therefore created a complex society destined for collapse. And I would agree. Technology is a bad idea. Any intelligent species that might evolve in the wake of our demise, our planetary successors, as you will lack the supply of inexpensive energy necessary to create a, quote, sustainable civilization. Following that line of thought, each planet gets one shot at sustainability. We blew ours when we let the neocons rip the solar panels off the White House and pursue economic growth as our only guide. And we went along. Again, you could argue, and I would agree, that civilization, any civilization, is inherently unsustainable, and that we can approach sustainability only by accelerating civilization's ultimate collapse, forcing us ahead into the sustainable societies of the post-industrial Stone Age. As the Buddha said, there is no torrent like greed. Or as Al Gore said in a speech a couple of years ago about national energy policy, this country needs a new dipstick. I didn't get the impression he was volunteering. That's okay with me. After all, here's a guy who thinks the climate crisis can be solved by a bunch of professional narcissists strutting around on the world's stages, stroking their Stratocasters. Sorry, folks, but even the world's greatest consumers can't spend our way out of this one. I just read the latest issue of Ode magazine, and there's a story, just a one-page story on page 38, about how that's exactly what we need. We need to take longer showers and keep consuming. We need to develop an industrial economy that is bigger and bigger so that we can afford to save the planet. I don't buy that. I'm not sure if that was clear by now. Every economic advance takes us further down the road of species extinction. Every economic advance takes us further down the road of polluting our water and fouling our air. Every economic advance develops a further, more complex set of living arrangements in an already too complicated system that destroys every aspect of the living planet. People ask me what I got my degrees in, and I tell them I got my undergraduate degree in forestry. I got my graduate degrees in range science. In other words, I have 3 degrees, a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in how to destroy every aspect of the living planet. Put that in your resume and suddenly the jobs don't come flocking your way. It's a funny thing. Speaking of the climate crisis, what about runaway greenhouse? Runaway greenhouse simply means that positive feedbacks are overwhelming Earth's climate system, and we cannot stop the warming of planet Earth. It seems that we're probably there. Had we passed the world oil peak a decade earlier, we would have been forced to reduce CO2 emissions and therefore prevent the frying of the planet, and therefore allow our species to persist many more generations. But apparently, I'm not ready to throw in the towel just yet. Apparently, peak oils came too late to save us from ourselves. It appears humanity will be restricted to a few thousand hardy scavengers living near the poles within a few decades. And shortly thereafter, Homo sapiens, literally interpreted the wise ape, Homo sapiens will join in extinction every other species to occupy the planet. Recent projections indicate that within a human generation, within 20 years from now, there will be no planetary ice. That's dinosaur days and the end of the human experience. It's very small consolation to me that as the home team, nature bats last. If recent projections are accurate, our species will persist about 1/3 as long as the typical species of mammal. And of course, we're going to take a whole bunch of mammals down with us, thereby giving credence to Schopenhauer's view that the human experience is the mere blink of an eye, bounded on either side by infinities of time. Despite our apparently brief stay on this most wondrous of planets, it has become clear we will take a large percentage of the planet's biological diversity with us into the abyss. This brings to mind another line from Nietzsche. If you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss stares back at you. We need to walk up to the abyss, look over the edge, and be willing to jump in. The time for action is now. The time for staring into the abyss and pondering what we might do is behind us. Alas, there is no torrent like greed. Knowledge of peak oil and runaway greenhouse leads me again to the question of Schopenhauer. How to get through a life not worth living. I've struggled mightily with this question, much to the chagrin of my wife, I can assure you, and have turned to my intellectual predecessors, the ancients, my heroes, for answers. I started, as I often do, with Socrates. Socrates pursued a life of excellence by questioning those who would tolerate him and his many questions. He knew we were beings singularly tuned to quality. Socrates found 6 primary questions pivotal to developing a life of excellence. These are the questions I turned my students to the last decade of my teaching career. These are the questions that represent the qualities Socrates found so important to the human condition. What is good? What is piety? What is virtue? What is courage? What is justice? And what is moderation? These 6 questions of Socrates lead us along the path toward a life of excellence. And these questions are as vibrant and relevant today as they were more than 2 millennia ago, when Socrates drank from that fatal cup. About the same time Socrates was getting himself killed for asking too many questions, the son of a wealthy king on the other side of the planet was forsaking the family fortune and asking some questions of his own. Unlike Socrates, the Buddha was willing to hazard a few answers, which have come to be known as his 4 noble truths. The first of these truths, life is suffering. It's hard to believe Schopenhauer wasn't a Buddhist, given the primary question underlying his philosophy. How do we get through a life not worth living when life is suffering? Never mind runaway greenhouse, the Buddha didn't even know about oil, much less peak oil. In the absence of such knowledge, the Buddha, like Socrates, concluded that a life of moderation contributes to a life of excellence. I think it's pretty impressive that Socrates and the Buddha reached the very same conclusion, even without the internet, to assist their obvious plagiarism. Which reminds me, I learned a great new lexicon when I was speaking at Northern Michigan University a couple of days ago. JFGI. Students are the source of so much knowledge, so little wisdom. JFGI. So, what is that? JFGI, what do you mean? Just fucking Google it, man. JFGI. Another thing I learned, one of the primary solutions, this comes from a very quiet, small woman who's sitting in the front row. She hasn't said a word yet. And she says, I think I know an answer here. If we're going to get out of this mess, don't be a douchebag. So I'm thinking the meme has got to spread. There's going to be bumper stickers all over the campus of Northern Michigan University, I'm sure next week. Don't be a douchebag. Pamphlets, flyers, spread the meme. Don't be a douchebag. In the spirit of Socrates and the Buddha, we may want to consider some moderation ourselves. In college lexicon, that means don't be a douchebag. Although it's clearly too late for moderation to solve the pressing predicaments associated with peak oil and runaway greenhouse. So then I return to the question, how to get through a life not worth living. Schopenhauer was a really smart guy, but his response to his own question is wholly insufficient. Will to live is inadequate for most philosophers who have followed Schopenhauer, and Socrates for that matter. And it certainly is insufficient for me. Nietzsche was perhaps the most brilliant person to occupy the planet so far. But his response similarly leaves me wanting. Will to power is meaningless if we abuse the power. And it seems that abusing power is what the hairless monkey does best. Small wonder that Nietzsche was impressed with Buddhism and the Buddha's second noble truth. After life is suffering, desire is the source of suffering. As Americans, we expect our every desire to be fulfilled. Planet Earth be damned. If our desires include Hummers and hang gliders, Tide takeout, plasma screen TVs, well, those are among the many rewards of empire, aren't they? As long as the costs of empire remain obscured from view, we're just as happy as pigs in a barn. So much for these two famous 19th century German philosophers, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. But even Said's unremitting optimism may seem unwarranted in light of knowledge that has emerged since his death nearly a decade ago. But wait, I'm not ready to dismiss Said just yet. My response to the question of Schopenhauer is rooted in Said-style optimism that is perhaps unwarranted, but is nonetheless undeniable. I'm sure you've heard the old expression, an optimist believes this is the best of all possible worlds, a pessimist fears this is true. My optimistic response to the question of Schopenhauer has two primary components, friendship and hope. I'll talk a little more about hope shortly, but I'll start with friendship. And I turn to Aristotle for my favorite definition of friendship. Aristotle defined friendship as a relationship between people working together on a project for the common good. People working together for the common good. Without the common good, we might as well restrict friendship to drinking buddies. The distinction is as clear as that between being a citizen and being a consumer. Sadly, I suspect most Americans don't know the difference. Sharing the arts and sharing the harvest are paradigmatic examples of the common good, making us friends in the Aristotelian sense, or friends I've never met before. In Aristotle's definition of friendship, we find traces of his teacher's teacher, Socrates. After all, one of the 6 primary questions of Socrates was, what is good? For focusing on the common good, I suspect Socrates would have been pleased with Aristotle, and perhaps even with those of us at this gathering. Although I admit it may be asking too much to expect the blessing of a long-dead Greek cynic. Speaking of Greek cynics, it's pretty clear the prophet of America's dominant religion was heavily influenced by Greeks, and especially the cynics. Jesus appeared during the time of the Greek cynics, and the cynics had profound influence on him and his teachings. Yet a Time magazine poll conducted 5 years ago found that 61% of Christians in this country believe God wants them to be financially prosperous. Well, that was before the Great Recession, so I suspect a lot of those people are hoping for something far short of financially prosperous at this point. Never mind the biblical root of all evil, never mind the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Mark. When 3 out of 5 self-proclaimed followers of a poor, homeless prophet who dedicated his life to working with the poor believe they are entitled to wealth, it's no wonder you don't hear much about the common good these days. This stunning statistic, the 61% number, brings to mind another of Socrates' questions. What is piety? The greatest generation of Tom Brokaw, the generation that saved the world from fascism during World War II, or so the story goes. That's the generation that begat the greatest generation of consumers in world history. It's been a wild ride, but it's time to turn out the lights. The party's just about over. The baby boom generation's legacy, their gift to you, is a world depleted of resources, ruined by empire, ruled by fascism, masquerading as republic.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. If at any time you feel inspired to a standing ovation, stop you. If you want to dance, they were doing that for the last gig.
Why not?
It's a revolution. If we can't dance at the revolution, I don't want to come. Who's that, Abby? Huh?
Emma Goldman.
In One with Nineveh, the ecologists Paul Ehrlich and Ann Ehrlich described the American social system as, quote, capitalism for the poor, socialism for the rich. Never has that been more apparent than in the last few years. Capitalism for the poor, grinding capitalism, socialism for the rich. Where's my bailout?
Really?
Yeah.
Our socioeconomic system is designed to subsidize the wealthy and pulverize the downtrodden. And, of course, pulverize our precious resources along the way. Contrary to society's general disregard for the common good, I have to believe that the greatest measure of our humanity is found in what we do for those who cannot take care of themselves. The myriad species, cultures, and, yes, even impoverished Americans in this country who never stood a chance in the face of American-style capitalism. I have to believe, in other words, that our humanity is measured in our willingness to protect the common good. And by pursuing and protecting the common good, we become friends in the Aristotelian sense. I'm willing to call the pursuit of the common good an exercise in virtue, bringing to mind another Socratic question. What is virtue? With today's focus on entertainment and sharing the harvest, we are pursuing the common good. By pursuing the arts, in a harvest gathering festival, we are pursuing the common good. But I will be the first to admit that we have our differences. Indeed, the wonder of DNA ensures our uniqueness, or as my brother says when he starts every college class, just remember you're unique, just like everybody else. The odds against any one of us being here are greater than the odds of picking a grain of sand off all the world's beaches. They're actually far greater than that. The odds of any one of us being here are greater than the odds against plucking an atom from the entire universe. To quote the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, in the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I that are privileged to be here, privileged with eyes to see where we are and brains to wonder why. Dawkins points out that we are the lucky ones. We get to die. And that means against all odds, we got to live. Enough about friendship for now. What about hope? The second component of my optimistic response to Schopenhauer's question. I view hope as the left brain product of love, analogous to democracy as the product of freedom or liberty. Notably, Patrick Henry did not say, give me democracy or give me death. Like the rest of the Founding Fathers, Henry knew that freedom was primary to democracy. Without the guiding light of freedom or liberty, democracy breaks up on the shoals. Love keeps our left brain in check. That's the message of the world's religions. But our right brain love creates the foundation for hope. Love for nature, love for our children and grandchildren, love for each other. Without love to light the way, hope breaks up on the shoals. Mind you, hope is not simply wishful thinking. And that's a problem, considering we're immersed in the ultimate wishful thinking, something-for-nothing culture. How else to explain books such as The Secret? Or, as they say in the movie, The Secret. The Secret proclaims that happy thoughts will lead to happy results, including personal wealth. If you just wish hard enough, you too can have all the gold in the world. Personally, I think gold is bitter. You can't eat silver. So I don't know why we're going down that path. But I digress. So how else, other than that wishful thinking, something-for-nothing culture, to explain the prevalence of and widespread acceptance of casinos in this culture? And it's not just acceptance, it's adoration, if the boob tube is to be believed. not to mention the big screen. Not so long ago, gambling was frowned upon because instead of adhering to a culture of an honest day's pay for an honest day's work, it reflects the expectation that a person can get something for nothing. No, hope is not wishful thinking. And another thing, hope is not a consumer product. You can't walk into Walmart and order up a carton of hope. I'll get that to go, please. Indeed, given the demise of cheap oil, there's unlikely to be a Walmart or any other large institution, for that matter, to walk into within a few years. Even if Walmart or the federal government somehow miraculously find a way to survive, we're going to have to generate our own hope, one person at a time. Just as economic collapse happens one person at a time, so too must hope happen one person at a time. When I'm not playing social critic, which I love, I'm a conservation biologist, or as I was described in a television interview a couple of days ago in Marquette, I'm a conservative biologist. That happened in the editing room, so I had no chance to correct it. So I'm a conservation biologist, and I admit conservation biology is a value-laden enterprise, hampered by, and perhaps assisted by, the bridges between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. The greatest value of Earth is, always has been, and always will be, that it exists. Not that it is useful, particularly not because it is useful for us. The Earth is not so valuable because it is useful, but because it is. Perhaps that makes me an artist trapped in a scientific pursuit, but at least for me it allows hope to emerge from the tonic of wildness, thereby providing context for this most insignificant of lives. It allows hope to flicker. And if there's a flicker of hope, I believe we must treat it as a beacon. Hope, my friends, is everywhere. Hope is the thing with feathers, said Emily Dickinson, and her poetry indicates she was not restricting her thoughts to birds. Dickinson found hope throughout the glory and wonder of nature. My friend and colleague, the planner Vern Swabach, is fond of saying he finds hope in, quote, a person's dedicated life. I cannot improve upon Vern's comment, but I can offer a few other personal examples. I find hope in the poems of the incarcerated teens and the incarcerated adults in the detention facilities where I taught stewardship through poetry. Late in my career, I was banned from teaching in my home department, which means that I was overpaid to do no work instead of to do a little work. You can see why I left. So, since I was banned from teaching in my home department, I taught in the Honor Scholars. The Dean of the Honor Scholars thought I was really wacky, but she didn't mind me sharing those wacky ideas with honor students, thinking they could figure it out for themselves. So I taught an honors class, and in that honors class I required each honor student to go with me to a juvenile detention facility and share some of their poetry. This is a science class, and the students were pretty freaked out by it. One, I made them write poetry. Two, I made them share it with incarcerated teenagers. So that was a riveting experience. I've taken these middle-class white kids, honor students, into a detention facility, had them interact for a couple of hours with incarcerated teens, the best description of which is a 15-year-old Latina who abuses substances and is herself abused in every imaginable way. Most recently, last week, she was raped by her mother's current boyfriend. She's been shot at, she's been knifed, her friends have died as a result of gunshots and knife wounds. So I take these upper middle class white kids in there and we hang out for a couple of hours and we share ideas and poetry. And then as we leave the institution, we stop on a bench on the way out and I ask one question every time. What do you think? And the upper middle class white student thinks back about the last 2 hours and the lives of those girls who are only slightly younger than him or her. And he thinks for a minute and says, well, they're just like me. Brings tears to my eyes when I talk about it today. They're just like me. So honor students recognize right away that the similarities of the human experience far overwhelm the differences. That we can come from either side of the tracks, and you're just like me. I see hope flickering every day in the eyes, and therefore in the minds and in the hearts of the students with whom I'm still fortunate to work on a regular basis. Hope is our humility overcoming our hubris in the face of long odds. This will require an enormous amount of courage. We must rise to Nietzschean heights in the style of the Overman, or the Übermensch. Hope is self-proclaimed liberals and self-proclaimed conservatives in the same barn, discussing our common future. Hope, then, rooted in friendship, is my response to Schopenhauer. Hope, in other words, rooted in friendship, let's call it platonic love, rooted in the right-brain friendship expressed by honoring each other and hugging trees. Will to live is no solution. It's a problem, as Schopenhauer himself admitted when he proclaimed, quote, "To desire immortality is to desire the eternal perpetuation of a great mistake." Do you think I'm a gloomy guy? Our will to live, rooted in the evolutionary drive to survive, makes us short-sighted and self-motivated, or in the case of many of us, self-absorbed. We are inherently incapable of considering, much less empathizing with, our grandchildren's grandchildren. That's why we're willing to bake the planet beyond the point of habitability within a very few generations. This brings to mind another question of Socrates. What is justice? Now, I don't know what justice is, but I know it is unjust to leave the world worse than we found it. It seems evolution dealt us a bad hand. It gave us the big brains, but they're not quite big enough. We're the wise apes. And in this respect, Google is this country, right? So Google has an infinite amount of knowledge and no wisdom. Here we are. Evolution drives us towards flight or fight, that is, to survival. If we survive, evolution drives us to procreate. Nearly 4 billion years of evolution are screaming at us to breed. Evolution has a pretty bad company on this one, including the world's largest religious group and the world's fastest growing one. If we clear those first two hurdles, if we manage to live long enough to procreate, evolution then prods us to acquire material possessions. And these three outcomes of evolution, the drives to live, procreate, and accumulate possessions, are disastrous to the common good. If Schopenhauer's will to live offers no viable solution, Nietzsche's will to power is even worse, for it reveals our darkest nature. Small wonder Nietzsche abandoned the Overman late in his career. Or maybe it was the Overman who abandoned Nietzsche. Maybe Said wasn't so far off the mark. Said said optimism. I say hope. Said said intellectual and political work. I say the common good. But we seem not so far apart, Said and I. Just like on close inspection, those of us in this place, on this most wondrous of planets, at this most wondrous of times, our intellectual and political work require, nay, demand, optimism. That's the primary reason I like to quote Said, because you almost never get to say nay in public. So that's kind of cool. Without that optimism, hope is lost for both kinds of humanity. Without optimism, hope is lost for the individual, personal variety of humanity that is the measure of our character. And without optimism, hope is lost for our entire species and many others on this planet. That hope is lost, too, without big doses of courage, justice, moderation, and virtue. Well then, how do we get from here to there? How do we, in the words of anthropologist and poet Lauren Isley, seek a minor sun when faced with our final freezing battle into the void? How do we as a species use our hope and our friendship to address the urgent issue of peak oil and the attendant economic collapse, while simultaneously addressing the issue of runaway greenhouse? These are the greatest challenges humanity has ever faced. Tackling either of them without the loss of a huge number of human lives and perhaps the loss of our species from the planet will require tremendous courage, compassion, and creativity. And I look forward to seeing a lot of that in the months and years ahead. Many experts who write about simply one of these issues, peak oil, predict complete economic collapse within a matter of months, followed shortly thereafter by utter chaos and the subsequent death of 80% or so of the people on the planet. After all, the exponential curve of human population growth tracks on a one-to-one line with the exponential curve of increasing oil production. So when we fall off that oil supply cliff, it appears that human population might be following it on the way down. If you think chaos can't happen to this country, you weren't paying attention to New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And as horrible as that event was, nearly everybody involved knew it was a temporary inconvenience. I'm concerned how people might act when they recognize peak oil as a long emergency. One by one, the world's cities will experience permanent blackouts. Once we enter the dark age, the post-industrial stone age is not that far behind. Bear in mind, I have mixed feelings about this. On one hand, I know the current culture, the culture of make-believe, or the culture of death, depending on how you want to describe it, is the worst possible route for most of the planet's species, including our own. As a conservation biologist, I realize the faster and more complete the collapse of empire, the greater our biological legacy. We might even save ourselves from ourselves. On the other hand, the paralyzing hand of fear grips me every time I think about peak oil. A life in the ivory tower is damned poor preparation for Stone Age living. Fortunately, I only think about it a few thousand times every day, so that's nice. Can we get from here to there? We have the best excuse in the world to not act. The momentum of civilization is powerful. Resisting those in power will almost certainly lead to imprisonment, torture, perhaps even death. Those are pretty good excuses to forego action. So the question becomes, in the words of author and activist Derek Jensen, quote, would you rather have the best excuse in the world, or would you rather have a world? To tackle peak oil and runaway greenhouse at the same time might require larger doses of courage, compassion, and creativity than we can find in ourselves. But I hope not. And that hope takes me to the bottom line. This is not the time for wishful thinking. This is the time for doing. The way to feel hopeful about the future is to get off your butt and demonstrate to yourself, and maybe even to others, that you are a capable, competent individual, determinedly able to face a new set of circumstances. And that's where we're headed, to a new set of circumstances. Socrates understood the importance of maintaining societal norms in the name of the law, even when justice failed at the level of the individual. Obviously, a lot has changed in the millennia that have transpired since Socrates drank from that fatal cup. I'll finish where I started, which was the common good as the basis for friendship and hope, and of course with the ancients. Without the common good and the struggle on its behalf, there can be no Aristotelian friendship. There can be no justice. There can be no virtue. Therefore, I am forced to conclude that 15,000 generations into the human experience, with the end of humanity in clear view, our shared goal must be the common good. I further conclude that, as friends, we reveal our differences, we appreciate our differences, and then we set them aside for the common good. With hope shining like a beacon, we struggle together for the common good. We have in our hands the destiny of the planet, including our own species and so many others. In the end, for finite species such as ourselves, the historical process is irrelevant. All we have is our legacy. But that legacy is lost to us as individuals. We are unique beings in that we are able to recognize the historical process as something larger than ourselves. We judge that process worthy or not worthy based on our own singular experience. For me, the universe is a worthy endeavor because the lens through which I view it is colored with the relationships I have experienced. Those relationships include humans as well as nature. All the Socratic ideals are born again in the love we feel for each other, for our families and tribes, and for the natural world. Walking a path that honors the planet and ourselves is a responsibility we share, you and I, a responsibility unlike any other in human history. And it is not just a responsibility, but also something more. It is a joy and a privilege. Thank you very much.